This is the third video for Module 9. We're going to discuss how to write a confidence interval. So first, just a bit of notation. A 95% confidence interval. What is that? It would mean that based on the data from your random sample, it's the interval of plausible values for the population parameter if we're using a significance level of 0.05. If you watched video 2, we had created a 95% confidence interval. We found an interval of plausible values for pi because all of those values of pi, when we conducted hypotheses tests with them, had p-values greater than 0.05. So they were plausible values contained in the 95% confidence interval. When we find that confidence interval, the way we'll phrase it at the end is, we're 95% confident that the true population parameter is between some value A and some value B, the endpoints of that interval. Similarly, we might create a 99% confidence interval. And that is really just exactly the same thing, except you're using a significance level of alpha equals 0.01. And in that case, you'd say you're 99% confident that the true population parameter is between A and B, the endpoints of that interval. Okay, so we're going to be writing out confidence intervals, and the two common notations that you'll see, one is what I call the margin of error notation, where you'll write the value of the statistic plus or minus the margin of error. And the other is using interval notation. So I'm going to go through two examples here where we show how to write these two notations. Okay, example 3 says to write a confidence interval for the population parameter pi in both of the notations if we know that the sample proportion was p hat equals 0.62 and the margin of error was 3.2%. Let's first discuss how a confidence interval always looks. A confidence interval always is an interval of values that has the value of the observed statistic right in the center. Then, to create that confidence interval, you will have a margin of error that you would add on top of that observed statistic in order to reach the high end of the confidence interval. And you would subtract that margin of error in order to reach the low end of the confidence interval. So in this problem, they told me that the value of the statistic p hat is 0.62. So that we can put right in the center of our confidence interval because the statistic is always in the center of the confidence interval. They then told me that the margin of error is 3.2%. But be careful, that's given as a percentage, whereas the statistic was given as a decimal. We got to make sure that they're written in the same notation. Since I started writing my confidence interval using decimal notation, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite that margin of error in decimal notation. So my margin of error is 0.032. So to finish my confidence interval here, I need to start at 0.62 and add 0.032 to that value in order to find the high end of the confidence interval. Right, there it is. The high end of the confidence interval would be 0.652. Similarly, I need to subtract that margin of error to find the low end of the confidence interval. So I need to start at 0.62 and subtract 0.032. That would land me at 0.588. So the interval of plausible values for pi is all these numbers from 0.588 up to 0.652. So one way that we can write that is with the margin of error notation. I would write it as follows. Pi colon is 0.62 plus or minus 0.032. Notice that's the margin of error notation. It's saying it's the value of the statistic p hat plus or minus the margin of error. That's kind of how we went about creating that confidence interval. You start at 0.62, you add 0.032, or start at 0.62, subtract 0.032, and you get the range of values. So the confidence interval can be rewritten in that way. Another way we can write the confidence interval is with margin of error notation. To write margin of error notation, you're going to write parentheses with a comma, as if you were writing a point. And then you write the low end of the confidence interval, and then write the high end of the confidence interval. I'm saying that this confidence interval spans from 0.588 up to 0.652. So pi is this interval from 0.588 up to 0.652. All right, let's try example 5. Example 5 says, write the confidence interval for the population parameter mu in both notations if we're confident that the true population parameter is between 412.8 and 422.3. So again, I'm going to kind of think about how a confidence interval works. A confidence interval always has the value of the observed statistic in the center, and it has the high end of the confidence interval over here and the low end of the confidence interval values down here. This is an interval of plausible values of mu. All right, in this problem, they told us that they think the value of mu is between 412.8 and 422.3. So in this problem, they are telling me the low end of the confidence interval is 412.8. So I put that down there. And the high end is 422.3. So I put that up here. And they did not tell me the value of the statistic. So I'm going to need to figure that out. But what we do know is that a statistic is always in the middle of your confidence interval. So what I need to do is find the number that's in the middle of 412.8 and 422.3. Well, that would be the mean of those two values. So I'm going to take 412.8 plus 422.3, and then I'm going to divide by 2. So when I add them up, I get 835.1. I got to divide that by 2. My calculator says it's 417.55. So that is the value in the middle. That must actually be the statistic that was observed. And since we're talking about a pool of plausible values for mu, it must be the case that our statistic was X bar. Sample mean. Okay, so writing this in the two notations, margin of error notation first, we're saying we think mu is the value 417.55 plus or minus a margin of error. Now notice, in the interval I wrote there, I did not label that margin of error. How would we find it? Well, a margin of error is that distance from your statistic up to the high end of the interval. Also, it's the distance from your statistic down to the low end of the interval. So all I have to do to find it is subtract. If I take 422.3 minus 417.55, that will give me the distance between those two numbers. Similarly, if you take 417.55 minus 412.8, you'll get the same number. So I pop it in my calculator, and both ways you do it, you get a value of 4.75. That means the margin of error is 4.75. The amount we add, the amount we subtract, 4.75. So when writing out the confidence interval in margin of error notation, we start with the sample statistic X bar, which is 417.55, and then you plus or minus, you add or subtract the margin of error, which is 4.75. So that's one way to write the confidence interval. The other way to write the confidence interval is with the interval notation. Interval notation, I'd say mu is as follows. We write our parentheses, we write the low end of the interval, which is 412.8, comma, the high end of the interval, which is 422.3.